long before science began to confidently fill in the blank spots on the map of the world. Strange rumors circulated along the western coast of Africa. They were told to sailors, traders, and the occasional travelers who lingered on the shore longer than usual. These stories were not written down in books and were not discussed in universities. They did not fit into the picture of a world that seemed almost complete. They were passed on quietly by the fire as if they were a warning rather than just a tale. People said that deep within the continent, where the jungle becomes too dense and dark, there lived forest people. Not beasts in the usual sense, but not humans either. Creatures capable of walking on two legs, possessing immense strength and a strange, almost conscious gaze. The locals avoided these places and were reluctant to guide outsiders there. They said that the jungle had a boundary, an invisible line beyond which you were no longer alone. Travelers spoke of tracks by the rivers, huge ones with clearly defined toes resembling human footprints but twice the size. At night, cries could be heard from deep within the forest, something disturbingly familiar, almost human but distorted. Guides often refused to go any farther, and it was not because of fear of predators or the difficulty of the path. They said that there in the remote jungle you were first watched. And then a decision was made. And for a long time these stories were considered nothing more than superstition, until one day someone decided to go too far. However, Europe at that time was not inclined to believe such things. In the 19th century, it was thought that everything that could be discovered had already been discovered, and that anything strange would sooner or later receive a rational explanation. Scientists said that Africa, of course, had monkeys and chimpanzees, but stories of giant human-like creatures were merely distortions of reality, exaggerations, or fear of the unknown. Even when strange bones or skulls occasionally appeared on the coast, too large and unusual in shape, this did not prompt any serious reconsideration of existing views. Without context, such finds remained curiosities rather than evidence. At the same time, there was a far more practical reason why no one rushed to verify these stories. For a long time, Europeans could not penetrate deep into Africa, not because there were no roads, but because the environment itself was deadly. The main enemy was malaria, which at that time was hardly treatable. Expeditions sent into the interior of the continent often ended before they reached their goal. People fell ill. Fever began. Delirium set in. And within a few days they died without understanding what was happening to them. Sometimes half the group perished, sometimes all of them. Therefore, most European exploration was limited to the coastline, and everything beyond it automatically fell into the category of the unknown, and therefore doubtful. Nevertheless, in any era, there are people who are not satisfied with the explanation. This cannot be. In the 1850s, such a person was Paul du Chaillu. He was not a typical scholar who spent his life among books and theories. He was drawn to places where maps ended and where others preferred not to look. He had heard the same stories about the forest people and did not consider them proven, but neither was he willing to dismiss them as fiction. For him, the only way to understand was to go there himself. The expedition he began to prepare had nothing in common with romantic notions of travel. It was an attempt to organize survival in conditions where a mistake cost lives. Weapons had to be gathered, not only for defense but also for hunting. Provisions had to be prepared that could withstand the humid climate. Protection from insects had to be considered, as they were not just a nuisance but a real threat. Special attention was given to finding guides because without people who knew the terrain, moving through the jungle became aimless wandering. But even experienced guides agreed reluctantly and often immediately set a limit beyond which they would not go under any circumstances. When the expedition finally set out, the first stages of the journey did not seem unusual. The coastal regions had already been partially explored. There were routes, known rivers, and settlements. However, as they moved deeper into the continent, the situation began to change. Trails became less visible, vegetation denser, and the forest itself began to create a sense of enclosed space in which it was difficult to navigate. The air was heavy, saturated with moisture, clothes remained constantly damp, and any food supplies quickly spoiled. Nighttime was especially difficult because the forest never fell silent. The constant background of insects, birds, and unknown creatures created the feeling that life there never stopped for a second. Sometimes within this noise, sounds appeared that could not be attributed to any known source. They were rare, but precisely for that reason they caused the greatest tension. As they advanced, the guides grew increasingly withdrawn. They spoke less, stopped more often, listened to the surroundings, and at some point began to hint that the expedition was approaching a place they tried to avoid. One of them said outright that beyond lay the territory of the beings spoken of on the coast, and that crossing this boundary was a choice left to the explorer himself. The first signs that the expedition was indeed near something unusual did not appear immediately. At first, there were broken branches at a height a human could not reach. Then tracks on the ground, large and deep, clearly left by a creature of great mass. But the strangest thing was the behavior of the environment. At certain moments, the forest seemed to freeze, and this silence felt like a warning. The decisive moment came when a sound was heard that could not be mistaken for anything else. It was a dull, rhythmic thudding, as if someone were beating their chest with their fists. The sound repeated with a certain regularity and was not random. It created the impression of a deliberate action meant to be heard. When Du Chaillu saw the source of this sound, all the stories he had heard before ceased to seem exaggerated. Before him stood a creature with physical characteristics that could not be ignored. A massive body, powerful limbs, and a gaze that contained something more than a simple animal reaction. This gaze was not empty. It carried an awareness of what was happening. The gorilla, this is what the creature would later be called, rose up, delivered a series of blows to its chest, and took a step forward, demonstrating strength and marking the boundary of what was permissible. At that moment, the situation became absolutely clear. Either retreat or confrontation. However, Du Chaillu understood that retreat would mean returning without evidence and therefore without result. He made a decision consistent with the logic of his time and fired a shot. After that, the encounter, which until then had been a tense observation, turned into an event with tangible consequences. However, the discovery itself did not mean the success of the expedition, because the main task was not only to find but also to deliver evidence to Europe. The body had to be preserved, processed, and transported through the same jungle that had already proven its danger. The members of the expedition faced disease, exhaustion, and lack of resources, and not all of them were able to complete the journey. Nevertheless, Du Chaillu managed to bring to Europe skulls, bones, and other evidence confirming the existence of a large primate previously unknown to science. However, the reaction of the scientific community was far from unanimous acceptance. Many scientists met his claims with skepticism, believing that he was either exaggerating or misinterpreting what he had seen. The reason for this skepticism lay not only in the lack of similar observations, but also in the fact that acknowledging the existence of such creatures required a reconsideration of how well the world had been explored. Over time, as additional expeditions and new confirmations appeared, attitudes began to change. The data brought by Du Chaillu ceased to be seen as an exception and became part of the broader picture. Europe was forced to acknowledge that the stories of the forest people had a real basis, and that the creatures long considered a myth were in fact part of nature. Thus, the story of the discovery of gorillas became an example of how a combination of limited knowledge, natural obstacles, and preconceived notions can conceal real facts for a long time. It also showed that the boundary between myth and reality is often determined not by the presence or absence of an object, but by the ability to verify it. And when viewed in a broader context, it becomes clear that many phenomena perceived at a certain stage as legends may in fact reflect real objects or processes, simply those that lie beyond the reach of observation observation.